This channel contains accounts of real crimes and may include details that are disturbing to some viewers. It is intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised. September 11th, 2021. A mother in New York dials 911 with a sinking feeling. Her daughter, 22-year-old Gabby Petito, hasn't returned her calls, hasn't texted back. Days stretch into weeks, and every message feels like it's echoing into nothing. Gabby had been on a road trip across America with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. They called it the adventure of a lifetime, a chance to document van life, explore the national parks, and share their journey on social media. But by the time that phone call was made, Gabby was already gone. 10 days earlier, Brian Laundrie had quietly returned home to Florida, alone. The van they had traveled in was parked in his parents' driveway. He offered no explanation. He contacted no one from Gabby's family. And when police came knocking, his silence only deepened the mystery. Days later, the nation would be gripped by headlines, police press conferences, and grainy body cam footage showing a tense moment between the young couple in Moab, Utah. A video that, in hindsight, would feel like a warning. But in those first hours, only one question mattered. Where was Gabby? Her last Instagram post showed her smiling beneath canyon walls, painting a picture of adventure. But investigators would soon uncover a darker timeline. A 911 call from a witness describing a man striking a woman, police footage of tears on the roadside, and text messages that didn't sound like Gabby's voice at all. On September 19th, searchers found a body in Wyoming's Bridger-Teton National Forest. It was Gabby. The coroner confirmed she had been strangled. And suddenly, the road trip story that millions had followed online became a national true crime case. But the story doesn't end with that discovery. In fact, it was just the beginning. Who was Brian Laundrie? Why did he return home without Gabby? And what clues did investigators piece together to reconstruct her final days on the road? Today, we retrace the journey. We'll look at the victims, the evidence, and the questions that still haunt Gabby's family and the world that watched in real time. Because behind the hashtags and the headlines was a young woman who should have come home. Instead, her life ended in the wilderness, leaving only silence and a trail of unanswered questions. This is the story of Gabby Petito, vanished on the road. To understand how Gabby Petito's disappearance became one of the most haunting true crime cases of our time, we first need to know who Gabby was. Gabrielle Venora Petito was born on March 19, 1999. Friends and family described her as adventurous, free-spirited, and full of warmth. She loved to paint, to draw, and to share her life with others. On social media, she posted videos, blogs, and pictures that captured her joy in travel and her deep love for nature. Gabby grew up in Blue Point, a hamlet on Long Island, New York. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where families have roots that go back decades. She was the eldest of 6 siblings and half-siblings, and her family often described her as the glue, the one who brought joy and warmth into their home. Blue Point is coastal, quiet, but connected to the larger sprawl of Long Island. It's far from the mountains and national parks she dreamed of, but perhaps that was why she longed for them even more. For Gabby, the road trip wasn't just about travel. It was about finding a bigger world outside the narrow lanes of her hometown. In the years before Gabby's disappearance, a cultural trend had taken over Instagram and YouTube: van life. Young couples and solo travelers were converting vans into mobile homes, documenting their journeys across deserts, mountains, and coastlines. The photos were striking: sunsets through van doors, cozy sleeping bags under string lights, remote campsites surrounded by stars. Gabby and Brian became part of this culture. They wanted to share their travels, grow a following, and maybe even make a career out of it. Their YouTube channel, Nomadic Static, launched in 2021, featured their cross-country journey. For many, the videos were inspiring. But for others, especially after Gabby's death, they became haunting, a record of smiles that masked unspoken tension. But van life isn't all sunsets and freedom. It's cramped, it's demanding, and it puts pressure on relationships. Long hours on the road, little privacy, financial strain. Every disagreement is magnified. Investigators would later point out that what happened to Gabby was not isolated. Domestic violence advocates noted that road trips, especially in confined spaces like vans, can escalate tensions. In Moab, Utah, just weeks before Gabby's disappearance, those tensions spilled into public view. A 911 caller told police he saw Brian hit Gabby. The responding officers stopped the couple on the highway. What followed was captured on body camera footage that would become central to the case. In that footage, Gabby is crying, saying she hit Brian first during an argument, describing herself as anxious. Brian tells officers he didn't strike her, only pushed her away. Officers separated them for the night. Gabby stayed with a van, Brian at a hotel. No charges were filed. No arrests were made. Officers believed they had calmed the situation, but domestic violence experts who reviewed the footage later said the warning signs were clear. Gabby's visible distress, her self-blame, and the power dynamic, all of it suggested she was in danger. That moment in Moab would later spark national debate. Could her life have been saved if more had been done? The other half of the story. Brian Laundrie was born in 1997, raised in Northport, Florida. Those who knew him in school described him as quiet, sometimes awkward, but artistic. He loved to draw, loved nature, and often talked about living outside society's norms. When he reconnected with Gabby, he seemed like the perfect partner for her adventurous spirit. But beneath the surface, there were signs of control. Friends of Gabby told reporters that Brian could be jealous, that arguments between them were frequent. In hindsight, Gabby's decision to move in with Brian and his family in Florida put her in an environment where she was increasingly isolated. Gabby's parents, while supportive of her relationship, later admitted they worried she was losing her independence. And when the van life trip began in July 2021, those dynamics went on the road with them. Investigators later pieced together that Brian controlled much of the couple's finances during the trip. He used multiple phones, accessed accounts, and kept in contact with his parents more than Gabby did. And then, after Gabby went missing, his silence became deafening. Brian returned home to Florida on September 1 with Gabby's van, but without Gabby. He didn't call her family. He didn't explain. Instead, he lawyered up, and within days, he disappeared himself. Gabby's disappearance might have stayed a local story, but social media changed everything. Her parents quickly went public, pleading for help. The hashtags and Find Gabby and A Justice for Gabby exploded on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. Millions of users, many of them young women, felt a personal connection to her story. They saw themselves in Gabby, a young traveler documenting her life online, trusting someone she loved. Journalists descended on both Blue Point, New York, and Northport, Florida. Night after night, national news networks ran updates. And yet, behind the media spectacle, Gabby's family endured a nightmare. Her stepfather, Jim Schmidt, traveled west to join search teams. Her mother, Nicole Schmidt, held press conferences through tears. Her father, Joe Petito, spoke bluntly, "We just want her home." The cultural impact was immediate. Gabby's case reignited discussions about missing persons, domestic violence, and the power of social media. But it also revealed uncomfortable truths about whose cases get national attention and whose are overlooked. Still, for Gabby's family, there was only one focus: finding her. Next, we'll retrace the events of August and September 2021. From the last time Gabby was seen alive, to the moment her body was found in the vast wilderness of Wyoming. By the end of July 2021, Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie had been on the road for weeks. Their van life journey had already taken them through Kansas, Colorado, and Utah. Their Instagram accounts showed the highlights: hikes in Arches National Park, wide smiles at Bryce Canyon, cozy campfires under desert stars. But behind those photos were stories only fragments of witnesses would later tell. Just 5 days later, Gabby called her family. On August 17, she told them she and Brian had cut their trip short temporarily and returned to Florida so Brian could move items out of a storage unit. That detail raised questions later. Why interrupt the trip to fly across the country? Brian returned to Salt Lake City on August 23 and reunited with Gabby. Their journey resumed, but the cracks in their relationship were widening. On August 25, Gabby posted her last Instagram photo, standing in front of a butterfly mural in Ogden, Utah. The caption read simply, "Happy Halloween." That same day, Gabby called her mother again. She said they were heading into the Tetons. It would be the last confirmed call Gabby's family received from her. On August 27, the cracks in their story deepened. Witnesses at a restaurant in Jackson Hole, Wyoming said they saw Brian arguing loudly with staff. Gabby was reportedly upset, apologizing for his behavior. That same night, a couple driving through Spread Creek dispersed camping area saw a white Ford Transit van parked oddly, with its license plate partially obscured. That sighting would later become a cornerstone in the case. 2 days later, on August 29, a woman named Miranda Baker and her boyfriend said Brian hitchhiked near Coulter Bay Village in Wyoming. He told them he had been camping alone while his fiancé worked on social media posts. But Gabby wasn't working on anything. Gabby was already gone. On August 30th, Gabby's mother received a text from Gabby's phone. It read, "No service in Yosemite." But Gabby was not in Yosemite. She had never been in California. Investigators would later conclude that message was not written by her. By September 1st, Brian was back in Northport, Florida. He drove the van they shared across the country, but Gabby was not in it. And here's the detail that still shocks. He didn't tell anyone she was missing. Not her parents, not police. For 10 days, Gabby's family called and texted Brian's phone, reaching out to his parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie. They received no response. Silence. Gabby's stepfather later said, "We knew something was wrong, but we didn't know how wrong until it was too late." On September 11, Gabby's mother reported her missing to Suffolk County Police in New York. Within hours, the story spread nationally. The FBI became involved almost immediately, coordinating with Wyoming and Florida authorities. The next day, September 12th, the Petito family released a statement. "Please help us find Gabby. She's everything to us." And America began asking the same question, where is Gabby Petito? Search teams scoured Grand Teton National Park and the surrounding areas. They followed tips, drone footage, and eyewitness accounts of the van. On September 19, 2021, investigators announced they had found human remains at Spread Creek. The body was identified as Gabrielle Petito. The coroner ruled her death a homicide. Cause, strangulation. Estimated date of death 3 weeks earlier, around August 27th. Her family's worst fears were confirmed. Gabby had not vanished. She had been murdered. But the story did not end there, because when Gabby was found, Brian Laundrie was gone. On September 13th, 2 days after Gabby was reported missing, Brian told his parents he was going hiking in Carlton Reserve, a swampy wilderness in Florida. He never returned. For weeks, law enforcement scoured the area. Cadaver dogs, boats, divers. Then, in mid-October, as floodwaters receded, Chris and Roberta Laundrie joined law enforcement for another search sweep. Nothing. Until October 20th, when his remains were found in the reserve, alongside a notebook. In it, Brian confessed he killed Gabby. The FBI later stated the cause of death was suicide, a gunshot wound to the head. The case closed on paper. But in the hearts of her family, in the minds of millions who followed every update, questions lingered. Why did no one intervene in time? Could Gabby have been saved? When Gabby Petito's disappearance was officially reported on September 11, 2021, the world's attention snapped to a small Florida town and a quiet neighborhood in Northport. A white van was parked in the Laundrie family driveway. Its owner, Brian Laundrie, was inside the house, silent. Police knocked on the door. No answers came directly from Brian, only through his parents. His attorney had already instructed him not to speak. And so, the most crucial voice in the search for Gabby, the last person to see her alive, went quiet from the very beginning. Investigators knew one thing immediately: Gabby was missing. But in cases like this, silence often speaks louder than words. Northport police seized the van on September 11. Inside were Gabby's personal items, her clothing, her laptop, and crucially, her ID. What was missing was just as important: Gabby herself. Investigators immediately noted that Brian had driven the van home, alone, from Wyoming. He had returned on September 1st, a full 10 days before Gabby's parents even knew she was gone. At this point, police classified Gabby as endangered missing, activating resources beyond local law enforcement. The FBI joined the search, deploying their evidence response teams, profilers, and digital forensics experts. But almost immediately, investigators faced their first challenge. Brian Laundrie was refusing to talk. His family directed all questions to their lawyer, Stephen Bertolino, who issued short, controlled statements to the press. For the Petito family, this silence was unbearable. Gabby's father, Joseph Petito, told reporters, "We just want her home. The fact that he's hiding behind a lawyer while our daughter is missing speaks volumes." The Laundries, however, claimed they were protecting their son's legal rights. But for detectives, the question was simple. If Brian wasn't going to talk, could the evidence in his van and on their phones speak for him? Inside the van, FBI forensic teams recovered fingerprints, DNA swabs, and electronic data. They pulled the black box from the vehicle, a small module that tracks GPS routes, speed, and engine use. From this, investigators mapped out the van's journey from Wyoming back to Florida. Each gas station stop, each roadside pause, data points stacked up like breadcrumbs. But the van wasn't the only digital trail. Investigators also subpoenaed Gabby and Brian's cell phone records. These records told another story, one of texts, calls, and suspicious gaps. On August 30th, Gabby's mother received a text that read, "No service in Yosemite." Digital analysis later revealed Gabby's phone had not been anywhere near Yosemite. It was last active near Grand Teton National Park. Investigators believe the text had not been written by Gabby. The next crucial piece of evidence came from Brian's phone records. Investigators learned he had returned to Florida alone on September 1st, and that he immediately purchased a new phone on September 4th. Why replace his phone just days after returning home? Detectives believed he was distancing himself from whatever his old phone might reveal. But the most chilling evidence wasn't from technology. It was from witnesses who crossed paths with Brian in the days after Gabby was last heard from. And their stories didn't match the image of a carefree road trip. On August 27th, multiple witnesses placed Gabby and Brian at a restaurant in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Staff recalled Brian arguing aggressively with waiters, storming in and out of the restaurant several times, while Gabby sat visibly upset, apologizing for his behavior. This was one of the last confirmed sightings of Gabby alive. 3 days later, on August 29th, a woman named Miranda Baker said she and her boyfriend picked up Brian hitchhiking near Coulter Bay Village. He told them his fiancé was back at the van, working on social media content, and that he needed a ride into town. But investigators already knew Gabby was no longer alive by that point. These contradictions painted a picture of a man constructing alibis while concealing the truth. Then came another report. On August 30th, a TikTok user said she saw Brian alone, hitchhiking again. His demeanor was described as calm, polite, but strangely eager to leave the area. To investigators, each of these sightings confirmed one thing: Brian was moving without Gabby. The timeline was narrowing. But while the timeline was tightening around Brian, one discovery would prove even more damning, and it was buried in the wilderness of Wyoming. The discovery of Gabby's remains. On September 19, 2021, searchers in Spread Creek dispersed camping area found human remains. Nearby were items consistent with Gabby's belongings. The FBI quickly confirmed the remains were Gabby Petito's. An autopsy revealed she had died by strangulation approximately 3 weeks earlier. The coroner's report concluded her death was a homicide. This was the turning point. What had begun as a missing persons case was now officially a murder investigation. But here's the complication. Brian was already missing. He had left his parents' home on September 13th, telling them he was going to the Carlton Reserve in Florida. Days later, when his parents reported him missing, law enforcement was faced with 2 searches at once, one for answers in Wyoming and another for a fugitive in Florida. The dual searches created a nationwide frenzy. News helicopters hovered over Northport. Reporters camped outside the Laundrie home. Online sleuths dissected every piece of evidence, from Instagram captions to phone data. Meanwhile, FBI agents continued to build their case, not just around what happened to Gabby, but around what Brian did next. And when investigators finally found what Brian left behind in Florida, it would close one chapter, but open another. Throughout September and October, law enforcement scoured the 25,000-acre Carlton Reserve. Conditions were brutal: waist-deep water, alligators, snakes, and heavy brush. For weeks, the search yielded nothing. Until October 20th, when investigators discovered a dry bag, a backpack, and a notebook. Nearby, skeletal remains were found. Dental records confirmed it was Brian Laundrie. The notebook contained a written confession. He admitted to killing Gabby. The FBI later confirmed that Laundrie wrote he was responsible for her death. And yet, the confession left gaps. His words did not explain motive. They did not explain why he returned home, silent, while Gabby's family searched. They did not explain why his parents waited days before reporting him missing. With Brian's death, prosecutors would never get their trial, but investigators weren't done. They continued building the timeline, ensuring Gabby's case wouldn't just close quietly, but would stand. As a warning about how critical every decision, every missed opportunity, can be in saving a life. Because as the investigation wound down, another storm brewed, not in the evidence, but in the court of public opinion. And at the center of it were the Laundries themselves. When Brian Laundrie's remains were found on October 20th, 2021, the possibility of a criminal trial disappeared with him. There would be no prosecution, no jury, no defense cross-examining evidence, and no final verdict spoken in a hushed courtroom. For Gabby Petito's parents, that reality was devastating. They would never see the man who killed their daughter stand before a judge. They would never hear him answer questions about why he left her in the wilderness, alone, while he drove home to Florida in silence. But that did not mean the legal story ended there. What followed instead was a series of lawsuits, public statements, and confrontations. That played out in civil courtrooms and in the national spotlight. A different kind of trial began, one in which the Laundrie family, the silence would be put under a microscope, and where the Petitos fought to ensure Gabby's story was not only remembered, but given the justice the criminal system could no longer deliver. In the weeks after Gabby's death, the Laundrie family became the target of public outrage. Why didn't Brian's parents, Chris and Roberta Laundrie, contact Gabby's family when Brian arrived home alone on September 1? Why did they go camping with their son at Fort DeSoto Park just days before Gabby was officially reported missing? And most pressing of all, did they know Gabby was already dead when her parents were still desperately calling, texting, and pleading for answers? Stephen Bertolino, the Laundrie's attorney, insisted they had no obligation to speak and were only following his legal advice. But to many Americans watching the case unfold, their silence looked like complicity. But silence can be deafening. And in court, silence, paired with knowledge, can become evidence of something more: intentional emotional harm. In March 2022, Gabby's parents, Joseph Petito and Nicole Schmidt, filed a civil lawsuit against Chris and Roberta Laundrie. The accusation that the Laundries knew Gabby was dead while publicly offering no help to her family. The suit alleged that the Laundries' actions, or lack of them, caused severe emotional distress. According to filings, the Petito family argued that the Laundries chose to remain silent, refused to respond to messages, and even went on vacation while Gabby's parents frantically searched for her. The complaint described this as cruel and outrageous behavior. The Laundries denied wrongdoing. Their attorney countered that silence, guided by legal counsel, was not evidence of guilt. It was a constitutional right. But in the eyes of Gabby's parents, this wasn't just about legality. It was about morality. During hearings, Judge Hunter Carroll allowed the case to proceed, stating that if the allegations were true, the Laundrie's silence might indeed have been considered extreme and outrageous conduct. For Gabby's parents, it was a small but important victory. Their day in court was no longer theoretical. But even as the lawsuit moved forward, another courtroom drama unfolded. One focused not on silence but on money, responsibility, and accountability for a life cut short. Later in 2022, Gabby Petito's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Brian Laundrie's estate. The estate was modest. Reports suggested it was valued at only $20,000. But the point of the lawsuit wasn't financial gain. It was symbolic. By holding Brian's estate accountable, the Petitos legally confirmed what the FBI had already concluded: Brian Laundrie killed Gabby Petito. In November 2022, a Florida judge ruled in favor of the Petito family, awarding them $3 million in damages. The Petitos announced the money would be used to fund the Gabby Petito Foundation, which supports families of missing persons and works to improve domestic violence response. It wasn't justice in the criminal sense, but for Gabby's family, it was accountability, a public acknowledgement that Brian's actions carried lasting consequences. And yet, the bigger question still loomed. What did Brian write in that notebook found beside his remains in Florida? Would his final words give the answers the families craved, or would they only deepen the mystery? In June 2022, the FBI released portions of Brian Laundrie's notebook. In it, Brian admitted responsibility for Gabby's death. He wrote that he killed her after she had been injured and that it was an act of mercy. But investigators and Gabby's family rejected this explanation. The coroner's report was clear. Gabby died by manual strangulation. There was no evidence of an accident, no medical report of a fatal injury. To many, Brian's words read not as truth but as justification, an attempt to frame his actions as compassionate rather than violent. For Gabby's parents, the note provided no closure, only confirmation of what they already knew: Brian had taken their daughter's life. And he had chosen to leave her body in the wilderness while he drove home, ate dinner with his parents, and went camping. The court of law may never hear Brian Laundrie's voice, but the court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. To millions watching across the country, Brian Laundrie was guilty. The aftermath of Gabby's death was not quiet. It became one of the loudest conversations America had seen about missing persons, domestic violence, and the silence of complicity. But as the memorials grew, so did the anger. Anger at Brian Laundrie, anger at his parents, and anger at a system that seemed to move faster when a young white woman was missing than when countless others disappeared without the same attention. But as thousands gathered with candles and prayers, another question rose: would Gabby's story spark real change, or would it fade like so many cases before hers? Across the country, Gabby's face became a symbol, not just of loss, but of connection. But behind every candle and every sign, another, harsher truth burned. Thousands of other families were still waiting, still searching, still pleading for someone to notice their missing loved ones. In the months after Gabby's death, lawmakers, advocates, and families of other victims pushed for reforms. In Wyoming, officials highlighted the lack of resources dedicated to indigenous missing persons cases. In New York, Gabby's family lobbied for stronger domestic violence awareness programs. The Gabby Petito Foundation funded searches for other missing individuals, turning donations into action. And on social media, Gabby Petito became more than a hashtag. It became a rallying cry for systemic change, to treat every missing person as urgent, regardless of race, gender, or social status. For some, the aftermath of Gabby's death was unbearable tragedy. For others, it was a turning point. But for everyone, it was unforgettable. After Gabby Petito's body was found, one fact seemed inescapable: Brian Laundrie was the prime suspect. But if the truth were so simple, why did so many people, from online investigators to seasoned law enforcement veterans, raise questions about whether he acted alone or whether something else was at play? Was Gabby's death a tragic culmination of a toxic relationship, or were there layers of unanswered questions about timelines, witnesses, and behavior that pointed to more complex possibilities? Next, we will explore the theories that grew out of confusion, anger, and the desperate need for clarity. Theories that range from the reasonable to the unlikely to the chilling possibility that key details may still remain unresolved. But first, let's go back to the very beginning of the speculation, the moment Gabby was reported missing and Brian Laundrie returned home without her. When Brian Laundrie returned to Northport, Florida on September 1, 2021, driving Gabby's white Ford Transit van without her, alarm bells went off for her family. But among the public, a question emerged almost immediately: could anyone else have been involved? The Grand Teton and Spread Creek areas of Wyoming were vast and remote, frequented by campers, hunters, and tourists. Online sleuths speculated, what if Gabby had encountered someone else after an argument with Brian? Adding to the speculation was the testimony of a TikTok user, Miranda Baker, who claimed she and her boyfriend had given Brian Laundrie a ride near Coulter Bay on August 29. According to her, Brian was acting nervous, refusing to stay in the car for long, and mentioned that Gabby was back at their van working on social media. But investigators later determined Gabby was already dead by that date, which meant Brian was lying, or that something about his movements in that critical window remained unclear. For many, this opened the door to the theory of multiple suspects, or at least accomplices, who could have helped cover up Gabby's death. But if Brian wasn't telling the truth about his whereabouts, was he hiding someone else's involvement or simply buying himself time? Another theory, grounded not in conspiracy but in tragedy, was that Gabby's death was the end of a long pattern of escalating domestic violence. Police body cam footage from August 12, 2021, in Moab, Utah, showed Gabby and Brian pulled over after a report of a domestic dispute. Gabby was crying, visibly shaken, while Brian joked with officers, downplaying the seriousness of the fight. Officers separated the two for the night, but did not file charges. For experts on domestic violence, this was a red flag. They believed Gabby's murder could have been prevented had officers recognized the warning signs and intervened more decisively. In this view, there were no alternate suspects, only a pattern of psychological control, manipulation, and eventual violence at the hands of one man, Brian Laundrie. But even if this theory explains Gabby's death, it doesn't answer another pressing question. Why did the Laundrie family remain silent, even as the nation searched for her? To Gabby's family and to the public, Chris and Roberta Laundrie's silence was more than suspicious. It was damning. From September 1st, when Brian returned home, until September 11th, when Gabby was reported missing, the Laundries said nothing. When police arrived at their door asking questions, they referred all inquiries to their lawyer. And when Brian himself went missing on September 13th, later found dead by suicide in Florida's Carlton Reserve, the family claimed they had no knowledge of his intentions. This led many to believe that the Laundries helped cover up Brian's actions, buying him time to escape or possibly destroy evidence. Legally, no charges were ever filed against the Laundrie parents. But to this day, public opinion remains divided. Were they protective? Parents relying on legal counsel, or were they silent accomplices? But silence has a way of echoing. And in that silence, more theories grew. Theories that questioned even the official narrative of Brian Laundrie's confession, when Brian's remains were found on October 20th, 2021. In the Carlton Reserve, investigators also discovered a notebook. In it, Brian confessed to killing Gabby, claiming it was a mercy killing after she had been injured. To many, this sounded less like a confession and more like an excuse. Experts pointed out inconsistencies. Gabby's autopsy determined she was strangled, not injured by accident. This fueled theories that Brian's final words were a last attempt to control the narrative, even in death. But skeptics asked, could the notebook have been staged or altered? While the FBI confirmed Brian was responsible, some believed his suicide left more questions than answers. And that leads us to the question still haunting many. What was Brian Laundrie's true motive? Was it obsession, jealousy, or something far less simple? Something we may never fully understand. For you watching, the theories raise questions that may never have final answers. Do you believe Brian acted entirely alone, or was there help, before or after Gabby's death? Do you believe his notebook confession was the truth, or a final manipulation? And what role, if any, should his parents have been held accountable for? Gabby Petito's story is not just about a young woman lost on the road. It is about unanswered questions that continue to divide families, communities, and even the nation. On January 21, 2022, the FBI officially closed the Gabby Petito investigation. In its statement, the Bureau confirmed that Brian Laundrie was solely responsible for Gabby's death. Evidence included, and his handwritten confession in the recovered notebook, and statements he made to family members in text messages and letters. His possession of Gabby's debit card, which he used after her death. For law enforcement, the resolution was clear. For Gabby's family, however, it was anything but closure. Her parents publicly thanked investigators, but insisted the real fight had only just begun. The fight. To raise awareness about domestic violence and to ensure no other family endured what they had. In the end, the official record says Brian Laundrie killed Gabby Petito, then took his own life. But for many, that resolution left too much unsaid. Why did the Laundries remain silent for so long? Why did Brian describe the killing as a mercy when evidence suggested deliberate strangulation? And could Gabby have been saved if early warning signs, from Moab police, encounters to domestic violence indicators, had been acted on? These are questions that remain unanswered. For Gabby's family, resolution did not mean peace. It meant taking their grief and turning it into advocacy through the Gabby Petito Foundation, raising awareness, supporting victims of domestic violence, and reminding the world that behind every headline is a daughter, a sister, a friend. If this story touched you, stay with us. Thank you for watching. If this case intrigued you, hit the subscribe button for more true crime fictional stories.